what is an activity?
Well, an activity is something that you do. It can be purposeful or not purposeful. And in the case of somebody with dementia, I think it's better to have purpose to an activity, not to be sitting there doing nothing, like having a television going. An activity relates somebody to another person, so one person to another person, and it should have an outcome. So I think that's what an activity does.
Very good. So how do you know when it comes to working with somebody with dementia, how do you know whether an activity works or not?
Oh, if it doesn't work, nothing happens. If the person doesn't like it, they'll tell you. Just because they have dementia doesn't mean that they're still not a functioning individual. They just have trouble with memory, or they might have trouble with initiating a task. But if the activity doesn't work, or it's too complicated, a person will get frustrated and they'll tune you right out. So just by looking at the person and paying attention to the person, you can see whether or not what you're trying to do is successful or not.
So when you say looking at the person, are we somewhere talking about body positioning? Is that what you're meaning as well?
If you are physically paying attention to the person that you're with, if you're looking at them, if they don't like what you're doing and they get up and walk out of the room, you know that it's not a successful activity, they've left. So if you say Elvis has left the building, the person has left, the attention has changed from the activity to not paying any attention. If they're hungry and they aren't paying attention, then you've scheduled an activity at the wrong time. So one of the things that I think of in regards to activity is how you set somebody up with an activity. And first of all, you need to pay attention if you can find out their diagnosis. I mean, if they have another diagnosis other than dementia, you want to get an idea what it is so you can pay attention to it. But you want them sitting properly so that they don't fall off a chair. You may need a chair with arms to prevent falling off a chair if somebody has poor sitting balance. You may need to raise the height of the table if the table they have is, let's say it's a coffee table and you go to set it up at a coffee table, somebody's bending forward, it's not the best position to be in. If somebody's in a wheelchair and the wheelchair can't get up to the edge of the table because it doesn't have desk arms cut out to allow the chair to get close enough to the table, you may have to put a lap tray onto the wheelchair and do it from there. So as simple as beginning where you're sitting, how they're sitting is how you want to begin. The other thing in regards to how somebody's sitting is if you put them in a chair and their feet don't reach the floor, nobody likes to have their feet hanging in space for any period of time. They're uncomfortable. They're going to be uncomfortable. It can be corrected by as easily as putting a weighted box under their feet so that their feet are stable to the floor so that they're not going to fall over. So that's positioning. So the other thing that I want to pay attention to is where am I in regards to my client or loved one or parent or whomever I'm with at the moment. And that could get into hearing. So if somebody can't hear at all, then you may have to give written directions. Or if somebody, in the case of my mother, she couldn't hear out of one ear. So my problem was, where do I sit? Do I sit next to my mother on the side where she can't hear me? Do I sit on the side where she can hear me, where it's the nicest, but I'm not really doing anything to push her limits? Or do I sit across from her so that she can see me and she can follow me more easily? So being a therapist, as well as being a child of somebody who had a parent with dementia, the therapist in me sat next to the bad side, the side where she couldn't hear me. And so I made her turn her head to pay attention to the side where I was. So the therapist made her move, and the daughter would have sat on the other side, making it pleasant, but I wasn't always the nicest. I was a little bit nudgy. So, so hearing is an issue. And I'm going to digress a little bit and go to food and eating. And some of the things with eating is, let's say somebody has macular degeneration. As an example, they have dementia, but they have macular degeneration and they can't see right in front of them. So if I put a plate at the table right in front of them, they're not going to see it. So I either have to move the plate further away from where I would normally put the food so that they can see their food. Or if I'm in a facility and I have a group of people sitting at a table next to each other, which because of COVID, nobody's really at a facility sitting next to each other so much anymore. But
Right.
you could have a situation where the person's eating from the neighbor's plate because they don't see their own food. They see the neighbor's food. So that doesn't necessarily go over too well. And what you want to do is change it to possibly delineate that person's space by putting even red tape on the table that this is your space, your food is within here, where's yours, don't go over past the space, so that you're giving a parameter to the person to stay within to be successful. And the activity is eating, and the success is that they actually ate and you didn't have to feed them, which is really good. And it didn't cause war with another patient possibly to the side of them. So body positioning for an activity where you're sitting is important. Hearing and vision is important. Sensory, let's say that somebody can't feel, they had a stroke in addition to having dementia. They can't feel to do two-handed activity, and an activity may have to be just with one hand. So you're setting up an activity based on somebody's limitations. When I do an activity, I like to figure out what's a good time for the person to do the activity. So personally, I find it most beneficial to do an activity in the morning after they've hopefully slept through the night. They've gone through eating, they've gone through dressing, and then they're ready to do an activity. So let's say if I start an activity at 10:30, if that's a good time in the morning, I would trigger the activity by putting a tablecloth on the table. And I just want to give a backdrop to that because I learned from my mother, because my mother had a glass table. And every time I would set her up for an activity, and I thought I was being so fantastic, she would look through the glass table and she would go, "Ah, look at my shoes. Aren't they nice? Look at the floor." And I would, "Oh my God, Mother, you know, you're not doing what I want you to do." So it started with a towel and it got to a tablecloth. And the tablecloth, I use a dark tablecloth if I'm working with something light colored, like playing cards or mahjong tiles or buttons or something that's lighter. And I use the opposite, the reverse, if I'm using something that's dark like dominoes or something, to make sure that the color contrast is working in their favor. So I will change the tablecloth during the course of an activity. Normally I would work 10 to 15 minutes is somebody's sitting tolerance. And if they are still interested, I would continue. If they're not interested, I would get up and do something different and hopefully a little bit more active, because nobody wants to sit if they don't have to for an extended period of time.
Right.
So that's kind of.
So let me ask this question. So you were 40 plus years as an occupational therapist, then a daughter. What was the difference? What was it like transitioning from a professional caregiver or professional occupational therapist to being a personal caregiver with your mom?
It was hard. It was frustrating. I couldn't leave it at the end of the day. It was my mother. It wasn't like it was being in the hospital with a caseload where you would go at 5 o'clock, you would leave. With my mother, it was like on all the time. There's a picture that I gave you to use for this that's on my book, and I gave you to use it. And it was taken at the time of my mother's dementia. She had it for 10 years. I got these 11 lines that I call them, that would be like pressure. She had died a couple of years ago, and since then they've like spread out a little bit. But at the time, I could see how tense I was, and people would say to me, "Are you angry? Are you angry with me?" And I would go, "No, it's just that it's very hard to have a loved one with dementia. It just doesn't go away. And it's very difficult. And I can tell you there was one time with my mother that she didn't like what I said, and she got really pissy, and I couldn't handle it. So I gave myself permission to get up and walk out of the room, which meant the day ended for her. I caught my breath. I had permission to leave. I gave myself permission. And when I came back in, I said, "Hi, Mom." And it was a brand new, "Hi, it's so nice to see you." And she had forgotten all about what had driven me crazy and driven me from the room. So it's very difficult when it's not your parent and not your loved one. You can kind of go, I'm going home in an hour or 2 hours. When it's your parent, you can't. So it was very hard. It was hard. It's not an easy illness. I think of it as an onion disease where you're peeling off levels of skill. Another person, we had a discussion and we were talking about it being like an apartment building where present day you're living on the penthouse. And as you are losing skills, you're getting lower and lower until you're at the basement. And so all those skills from the basement or the first floor up to the penthouse are skills that you might have lost. Or it could be pieces of it that you've lost that you haven't lost all of it. Or the problem with dementia is that there's different types of dementia, and some people have hallucinations and some don't. Some get negative and some don't. So looking at a person with dementia, you need to look at the whole person and how they're functioning today. Can they eat by themselves? Can they get dressed by themselves? Can they toilet by themselves? So if they can do it, no problem. If they can't do it, that self-care, the ADLs, becomes part of your activity of what you're doing with somebody. So getting dressed is an activity. I think when we were chatting earlier, we talked about a task versus an activity.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an activity of getting dressed, I want to break down the activity. This is in my mind. I want to break down the activity into steps. And one of the first steps would be the weather. I want to know, are we going to go outside? Is it freezing? In which case, the clothing that I'm going to wear has to relate to the weather if I plan on going outside. So my suggestions to the individual would be, let's open the window and see what the temperature is like outside and the weather. That's a task. It's so cold today. I think you're going to need a sweater. Which sweater would you like? Now, if they have no trouble with choosing, no problem. If they have trouble with any choice, I would go, here's a white sweater and here's a black sweater. Which one would you like? If they're not able to make the selection, I would go, here's a sweater. I think it's cold outside. This would be a good one. So that's a task in the getting dressed sequence of activity. The other thing that I was thinking about, I was looking at a webinar the other day, and what they were talking about is that clutter can cause agitation. So if I were to say to client A that I want you to choose a sweater, they're in your closet, and you go into a closet and you have all the clothing that they've accumulated for the past 100 years, they're not going to be able to choose because there's too much choice. So you really need to declutter to make somebody be able to succeed. So that's another one. And so self-care is an issue. And that can be a morning's activity. As far as it goes with the caregiver, if a caregiver succeeds in an activity, they're great. Caregivers, God bless caregivers. We were very fortunate for my mother that we were able to have somebody stay with her. And I had made a promise to my mother that I would take care of her as long as I could. And her request was she didn't want to go into a nursing home. And I said, Mom, as long as I can do what I can do, I will do it. When I reach a point I can't do it anymore, I'll do the best I can for as long as I can. So there's so much guilt associated with caring for a family member that's losing skills. How much can you handle? How much can you take? And it's important to know your limitations. Don't make promises you can't keep, and give yourself permission to back off and get help if you need it. And as simple as when my mother was making me nuts, permission to leave the room and come back in again. You have permission to breathe. You have permission to take care of yourself. If you don't, you're going to burn out. And with my mom's illness, she was sick for 10 years. 10 years is a long time. It's just a long time. And if you don't have help, if you don't have the support of your family, if you don't have financial support to help you, it is an overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. And I have found personally that most of the people that I know that have dementia don't have anything else wrong with them. They are, the Yiddish word is they're a starker. They're good, they're sturdy, they're fine. There's nothing wrong with them except their memory is just gone. So it's difficult. It's difficult. I wanted to talk a bit about another activity as far as choice goes. And this is a sitting activity, and it's not for male or female. I don't want to be accused of saying that I do something that's gender specific. This is neutral. So if you want to color, and I happen to like coloring, so let's say that I sit somebody properly at the table, that they're not going to fall off the chair, their feet are set, and I have, I'm going to get some crayons. Got them here. I like them, and I might have mentioned I like Melissa and Doug's crayons. They are bright, they're vibrant, they're triangular, they won't roll off the table so that you're not having to go chasing them. They don't leave that goo on your hand. I should be a spokesperson for their crayons. And so let's say I want to do coloring. Oh, I got ahead of myself. Before I color, I want to decide what I'm going to color so that the activity is not, oh, let me go get it, I'm going to say. So I printed out some things to show you. If somebody's really advanced, they have coloring books out now that are gorgeous, but they're inappropriate because they're too detailed and they're too fine. This is, can you see it? I Googled simple children's pictures, coloring pictures, and printed them out. And the reason that I like them is because the borders are dark black, they're easy to see, and it's not too much confusion on the page. You can find children's coloring books and you can rip the page out. You don't have to keep it in the books, and lie it flat so that it doesn't get all difficult to keep down while you're coloring. And you could even cut this into sections so that I have just a picture of a carrot, or just a picture of a radish, or just a picture of a tomato. And the discussion is, here's a picture of some balloons. Let's color them in. All right, so that I've already chosen what we're going to color in. So then I can choose my crayon, and I can say to them, I have a red crayon, I have a green crayon, I have a yellow crayon. Which one would you like? If the activity isn't working, they're not picking anything. Do they hate the activity, or do they don't know what to do? So I can change it. I have two crayons. I have a red crayon and a green crayon. Which crayon would you like? They can't choose. I have a red crayon. Let's start with the red crayon. Let's color the tomato red. So I can define what it is I want somebody to do. If I give somebody a blank piece of paper and have them color, it's almost too much white space. Unless I say, let's draw a square. Let's draw a circle. Can you make a face for me? You have to give some skill set to it so that they know what you expect them to be doing. And then let's say you have a picture that you've printed out of a bird, and you color in the bird, and oh my God, what a great job you did. Let's sign it. You have the person sign it, tape it up on the kitchen wall. When we go outside later, let's look for birds. So let's say you go outside and you go to look for birds and you don't see any birds. You don't have to have a discussion about the birds. You could have a discussion about a tree. You could have a discussion about the sky. You could have a discussion about the weather. The bird is just a means to improve interaction between you and your client. It helps you out to give you an idea. It helps the person to have something to think about. And it's something that you can tell that it works. If it doesn't work, change it. If you go outside and you're all set that you're going to talk about birds and there isn't a bird and it's freezing and they're talking about, let's sit down, I don't want to be outside and not sit, then your whole discussion changed. Go with it. So as much as you're determining what's happening, the individual is really the one that's in control of whether your best laid plans are going to continue or not.
You actually just answered the question I was getting ready to ask. Maybe there's a chance to expound, or if you just said, Jason, that's we've covered it, is how do you assess an activity, whether you know it's working or not?
In my book, I developed an assessment form. And the form is as simple as, what time of day did you do it? Where were you seated? Did it work? What paraphernalia did you need to make it work? Did they like it? Did they hate it? Did you do it after breakfast? After lunch? Did you do it before dinner? Was it too late? Was sundowning coming in? So that part of my concern was when I wrote my book was that caregivers come on duty at a certain period of time, and at the end of the day, they're gone. And the next caregiver comes in, and I wanted caregiver A to have a way to communicate with caregiver B. And my background was really in hospitals for 40 years, and they had a shift change for nurses that they would discuss what happened with the patient. They would discuss medical, they would discuss what tests they had, they would discuss if they had any falls. There's no changeover for activity. And when you deal with somebody with cognitive loss, activity is what you're really talking about. So I wanted to have a means of communication that the next caregiver that came on knew what happened before she walked in the door. I tried to sit somebody at the kitchen table to have breakfast, and they were ripping at me because they only eat at the dining room table. Well, caregiver B doesn't have to reinvent the wheel by placing the person to eat at the kitchen table. They're already aware of what's going on. And the other thing that does is it validates what the caregiver is doing. I have some other things here just as a sample of things which I have found. I have poppet beads, which I like, which is a two-handed activity that are not necessarily poppet beads. They are colors. So I have the red. I had that red crayon before. I can find everything that's red. I have a spool of thread that's got red thread. I'm finding everything red. And then we could have a chat about what food do you eat that's red? Can you tell me something that's red? The other thing I have that I liked is I have stringing blocks. And here's a red block. Here's a red. And we can match them so that it doesn't have to be just a poppet bead for sake of poppet beads, or just bead stringing for sake of bead stringing. There's some people that like to do stringing of pasta, which I'm not a pasta stringer, unless it's for possibly a necklace for a kid that you want to do for a birthday present. The only time that I would do bead stringing is if, and I have strings here, if I want to copy. So if I have a strand of beads and I'm going to put red, green, and yellow on mine, and then I'm going to hold it up, I want you to copy my pattern and do red, green, and yellow. Let's see if we can make patterns that match each other. And if they can, fine. And if they can't, I can go down to one bead at a time, or I don't do it at all. The other thing I can do with beads, and we did this with, we did a lot of competitions, my mother and me and my clients, and we built we took the blocks and we did building, and we went to see how high we could build it before it would fall down. And then we would keep score. If I was working in the hospital, I would do it for somebody that was working following a stroke, maybe for gross hand control that I wanted to do my hand strength. I wanted to do arm raising. So I would make the table be the platform higher, and I would have their arm come higher and higher to get arm strength. That's not the issue necessarily with someone with dementia. I'm working just to have somebody be able to stack something and pay attention to stack it. The other thing that is an activity that you could do around the house, and that's folding laundry. So you can fold a shirt. So what's my goal when I wanted to do laundry folding is it's a repetitive activity that's something that they're probably familiar with. So if I'm not concerned with their arm movement and I just want it to be here, if they have poor shoulder control, or I want a little piece of fabric. If somebody has trouble breathing and you want to increase their arm strength and you want to increase their endurance, I'm going to take a bigger piece of fabric, because it means that they have to stretch their arms out, which means that they have to work a little bit harder. And that's good for somebody who might have breathing problems, because you want to get their arms out to increase lung capacity. You want to get their arms moving. You want it to be more physical. So I can go from sitting down and coloring to laundry. And it's an activity. It doesn't have to be an art project. I mean, you can blow bubbles. I love to blow bubbles and then pop them. I think that's kind of neat. You have the eye tracking, you've got bubbles. The other thing that I've done with people that I really like, that's the therapist in me, is to get a bag of uncooked rice and pour the rice into a specific bucket and hide things in the rice that they have to find. So it's sensory, they have to feel for it. And I do copy things. So I might take a block, I might take a fork, I might take a spool of thread and hide it in the rice. And I have a duplicate of what's hidden on the counter. And I'll say, find me the block. And they have to put their hand through the rice, find the block. And if they're wrong, no good, put it back, do it again. And that's good for about a good amount of time. I like rice a lot. One of the issues that I have with my mother, and it's just kind of just jumped into my brain, is the day that she didn't know my name. And I wanted her to know my name. I wanted her to know who I was. And I found it exceptionally difficult that my mother didn't know who I was. So here I was the daughter, reacting as the daughter, not as the therapist, but reacting as the daughter, saying, "Hi, Mom, it's Judy. I'm so glad to see you. Do you know who I am?" And the caregivers in the background going like this, "Don't do that, don't do that. You're putting pressure on her, it's wrong." And I knew it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong. And finally, my mother looked at me and she says, "I think you're my aunt." And I said, "I am, and I'm so glad to be here today." And I realized that it doesn't matter what I want. It's important what they want.